All right, we are at 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, so we will begin. You should be seeing the TRX webinar series screen. If not, please go ahead and type in the chat box and we'll try and get that squared away for you. First off, good morning. I'm Jason Thomas, the Portfolio Manager with America Makes and your host for today's America Makes TRX webinar series. A little background on the TRX webinar series before I introduce our speaker. As America Makes continues its mission to expand and accelerate the footprint of additive manufacturing and 3D printing, this medium, called the America Makes Technical Review and Exchange webinar series, was created. By creating this platform, it allows the additive manufacturing and 3D printing community to come together and share knowledge and experience with the broader community. If you or your team are interested in presenting during the TRX webinar series, there will be a link to complete the request form at the end of our series today, or you can contact the America Makes Membership Director, Tiffany Westbay, directly. A few important notes before we kick off the series. At the end of the presentation, there will be an opportunity for a brief Q&A session. So if during the presentation you do have a question, please submit it in the Q&A space on your WebEx screen, and we will ask it during the Q&A session. We will do our best to get all the questions answered. Today's webinar is on stepping through the additive manufacturing workflow for process and materials validation. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Mike Vasquez from 3 Degrees. Dr. Mike Vasquez is a 3D printing expert specializing in pushing the boundaries of advanced 3D printing technology. He is the founder and CEO of 3 Degrees, a Chicago-based consulting company focused on helping organizations maximize their investment in technology. Over the past decade, he has worked side by side with some of the top machine manufacturers, material producers, and end users in the industry, consulting with them to identify novel applications, test new materials, and develop frameworks to maximize R&D efficiency and to boost ROI. In the past 18 months, Mike has worked with a dozen companies to help them set up successful and safe facilities. He has also created a software tool called Trace. It aims to assist companies formalizing their use of 3D printing to ensure they can meet quality and technical standards outlined by the supply chain and industry requirements. He completed his PhD in additive manufacturing at Loughborough University and received both his bachelor's and master's from MIT in materials science and engineering. So now, Mike, I'll turn it over to you and your team.
Thank you so much, Jason, and thanks as well to Tiffany for helping set this up. So I'm excited to have the next hour of your time, and we're, I think, going into a topic that we've seen at least a lot of interest in over the last 18 months or so, broadly speaking, in the entire additive manufacturing industry. So kind of the focus of what we're going to talk about today is kind of stepping through that additive manufacturing workflow, really in the context of moving your facilities, your operations to production. And we're going to do that in a couple different fashions. So those be 3 big kind of areas of discussion today, and we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. So I think there's as Jason mentioned, a vehicle that you can add in some questions and populate those for the end as well. So we'll kind of do 3 things today. First, I'll give some context of what we do and how it's relevant to the discussion today. Then we'll dive into a little bit of detail on kind of what's the state of kind of what going through the workflow and developing kind of procedures and processes that are validated both for your materials as well as your machines. And then kind of through that discussion and kind of laying the groundwork, I'm actually going to show you kind of a live demo of a tool we've been working on that kind of helps articulate that a little bit more. And hopefully, I think by the end of this, we'll give you some thoughts, best practices, and maybe some ways of thinking about how to organize the data that you may generate or you may be thinking about generating as you go through the process of thinking about additive manufacturing in the production realm. So that's kind of the outline for today. I won't spend too much time on this. Jason kind of did a good job here, but so I founded 3 Degrees, which is a consulting company kind of about 7 years ago. We're based in downtown Chicago, We've got about, I think, 5 people working for our team now, a lot of materials engineers, a few software developers as well. But really the focus of kind of why I started the company was to kind of help organizations think through kind of what does it mean to use additive manufacturing for production. First, in the context of kind of thinking through kind of the business plan, where does it make sense to use additive, when does it not, and then kind of building from that, how should you think about actually making this into a robust, repeatable, certainly cost efficient, and kind of technically sound process in a facility that's doing real manufacturing. So we've done that with as kind of an intermediary in the space. We've worked with end users. We work with kind of companies that are making machines as well as material suppliers. So over the last kind of 7 years, we've done projects with about 40 different companies from, I mentioned, a lot of different industries, a lot of different contexts. So you kind of name the industry we've probably worked in, and hopefully some of the industries that you all are listening in on are relevant, and some of the things that we'll talk about resonate there. But we've done a lot of work in aerospace and automotive and areas that you'd expect that are kind of looking at additive from a production realm as well. So kind of getting into the details a little bit more of kind of why are we kind of talking about materials and process validation, and why is that workflow important? And I always like to start with this kind of slide. One, because I think it's relevant as well as kind of timely, but also in kind of my own personal life, my family just welcomed a newborn, and kind of my life, other than additive manufacturing, is filled with kind of dirty diapers and baby memes. So I'll kind of subject you to that for the next hour. So kind of this idea that we've seen certainly over the last 3 years, kind of accelerating over the last kind of couple, is this idea that everybody's kind of going about their additive processes and trying to get those business cases, those best practice, or kind of 1 or 2 kind of applications in their industry or in their company that they can find the use case for 3D printing, and so a lot of people are focused in on that. And you see kind of press releases and things about that when you like, hey, we've demonstrated that this part can be made or design optimized or something like that. But that's all great. That's all good, especially if you can match up the price and cost and things like that. But I think what we've seen is that kind of as that reality hits the road, and there's real expectations, like there's kind of, we're scaling up to do kind of production at a wider level or get more machines. You have to think more clearly about things like production volume, kind of use of the material, if that's available, where you're getting your material, training new team members, kind of growing beyond that R&D kind of mindset. And so kind of what we've often seen is kind of this kind of excitement around 3D printing gets to a point where you get some use cases that are viable, and then kind of you throw down kind of the reality of kind of scaling that up, and especially as you start to consider other things, it makes for a challenging ecosystem, and especially because many of you who are probably listening in on this are really still paving the road of what is additive manufacturing going to look like for production. So I believe that additive manufacturing is kind of fundamentally driven by materials, but it kind of gets complicated beyond that because you have a lot of different variables. And kind of the heart of what I'll talk about today is how to make sure that you're not overwhelmed by all these different variables, but at least have a framework to kind of bucket them in terms of different steps in the process. So kind of in the context of 3D printing materials, you're often using kind of materials that may not necessarily be exactly what you would use from traditional manufacturing. You have different alloys in many cases. You're probably using it in a powder or some sort of form that you may not be used to in terms of casting or injection molding, or it may be. the material and vendor supply chain is still kind of evolving. A lot of that is intermingled between who you buy your powder from, and the machines are kind of coming together, as well as the fact that standards are quite limited. You get data sheets, but those data sheets are kind of varied throughout the industry. There's not really an industry standard, and at the same time, standards for both kind of machines as well as the materials don't necessarily translate to specification sheets for what you're doing. So there's kind of some work that needs to be done, really get to a point where you can trust the material, trust your process of what you're doing. And that's all getting better. I think people recognize that. But I still think there's a ways to go, and we're kind of in this gray area until we get more adoption to really move that along. So in terms of kind of what's the state of the industry now, you've got a couple of options for validating kind of processes and materials, but really starting to think about it in a couple different ways is usually I think about it as kind of a hierarchy. So you have the parts that you're making. So what encompasses that is kind of the materials that go into it, like the process kind of inputs or process parameters that generate those kind of part values. So things like if you make tensile bars off the machine, you typically have some sort of data sheet that generates that. But it's kind of, that's the first element of kind of production and repeatability. Then you get into kind of things like applications, where if you're in aerospace or automotive and you require certain chemical resistance or UV requirements, you start to get in another level of testing or standardization that needs to be explored with your parts, in addition to kind of what comes out of the machine. And then on top of that, you have kind of what goes into your facility. So making sure that your machines are somewhat standardized, your post-processing is standardized, your operators, your other team members are standardized. So kind of at each of these levels, I can't point to one kind of overarching additive manufacturing way to do things, because the industry is so varied depending on what type of material you're using, your process, things like that. But kind of there are kind of bits and pieces starting to get generated, which I'll go into in a second, that are starting to kind of help build this, or at least you can look to other industries and what some of the standards organizations are doing to help you accelerate this process. So kind of first principles approaches that I've seen, and what we've seen as we've worked in the industry a number of years now, is that depending on kind of the either corporate pressures or kind of market pressures that you may be seeing, as well as your industry requirements and kind of where you're starting, and things like, is it a kind of flight ready part or something that's going to be a support bracket for a non-critical element in a component. There's a big spectrum of kind of what do you actually need to do to make sure that your process and materials are kind of validated and produced in a way that makes sense. So at first principles, I mean, you can look at the data sheet, you can get a pretty good idea of what your reproducibility is, at least a baseline, and what you're looking for. Some people work very closely with the vendor to help develop applications. A lot of them have great applications engineers and teams to help you do that, especially kind of working in their ecosystem. Some companies are developing their own standards. America Makes is helping kind of partner with some of those efforts and kind of get that out into the public as well. So there's a bigger pool of data to do that. And some folks are kind of doing a hybrid where they're adapting their own kind of procedures and processes they may have for welding or injection molding, and trying to see how it kind of maps over to additive. But all of this kind of depends on your budget, the industry, your organization, how sophisticated you are in terms of process and materials testing. Often this can take if you're really doing a kind of super comprehensive job of validating your processes and materials, you may require a research lab, kind of materials lab and testing and things like that. So if you have that internal, great. If you're sending out specimens, that just added cost and time. So just this is all kind of really to lay the land of kind of how you should, what are people doing now, what's kind of the best practice, and part of my kind of presentation as we get into this will kind of not just be the demonstration kind of high level slides, but I'll actually go through and walk through the process with what we're doing on the software side. So getting to this, like, kind of that's all great of the state industry, like how can we, after this hour, kind of what are some of the things you could start to take away from here? First, the way I think about it and the way kind of our team thinks about it is that 3D printing is not just the material input or the printer itself. It's really the entire process and the entire process chain. So we think of that as starting with design and how you're formulating the CAD data all the way into things that you may be doing in the post-finishing phase that kind of reaches the point of what's actually going to be hitting the customer hands or in the vehicle or in the real world application. So actually the material and process, while highly significant, is not the entire story. So you really need to think about kind of process and material validation at that level, at a higher level of what are the different inputs that could impact your outputs, which is your final part. So we think of it kind of in this kind of process flow map. And for any of you who are kind of wondering, I'm happy to share these slides. There's nothing confidential here. So if you, rather than variously writing notes or something, we can share all of this as well with at the end. So really kind of what we're saying here is that at each step of this kind of workflow, from design to inspection and final part, there's this kind of story that you're building about each of these steps, and ultimately about each of the parts that you're using. And there's steps that are material dependent and steps that are process dependent and everything that goes in here. So kind of you have your CAD data ultimately from an engineer that may design the part, kind of what you're doing to fix STL files or orient really the part on the build, support structures, which are critical, your materials. There's a whole host of things we'll talk about in that. Your post-processing or your actual process printing, post-processing, heat treat, finishing, surface coating, surface treatments, and inspection information. So all of this kind of really goes into that full story of the part and what you really want to make sure you at least have a handle of, or some sort of answer when you're looking at kind of auditing your process. So when you're kind of basically starting out, or even if you're kind of in the throes of doing this, we found it most effective to think about it at this entire spectrum. And so as I mentioned, production validation is not just about the in-process data generation. I mean, there's a lot of kind of great kind of efforts going into, okay, what does each layer look like, and is my weld pool thermally kind of consistent and managed and things like that. That's part of the story, but just as important is, okay, if after all of your processing you use some sort of unique heat treat or some sort of surface coating, the as-built part looks very different than the finished part. So not only is that kind of critical, but kind of the operations behind the factory are important as well. So how you're training your different operators, what your standard operating procedures are, kind of how you're speccing your materials, your process information, and kind of maintenance of the machines is critical, as well as your ancillary equipment, because all of this kind of really focuses in on kind of how do you make your kind of workflow kind of beyond the printer kind of efficient and reproducible, and in a way that can be documented and scaled up ultimately is the hope for all of these operations. So kind of getting into that, what I'd like to do is just share a little bit of kind of work that we've done in this space, just learning more. So we've worked with a number of organizations as they've gone through this process of like say, hey, like we've got this great business case, we're in kind of early days of ordering new machines and kind of think we can scale this up. Kind of how do we actually make this a sophisticated process, and what do we need to do from a data generation perspective so that we are in a position as the standards catch up, or as we have to go through the process of satisfying our industry standards to make this work. So in doing that, what we quickly realized was that there was a pretty big gap in kind of what was available from a prototyping perspective in additive. We kind of have this technology that's been around since the 80s, a lot of different embodiments from stereolithography to FDM to SLS, but really all focused primarily early days on this prototyping mentality and maybe low fixtures and tooling and things. So the requirement to track a lot of this information wasn't there. And now as companies are moving towards the ability to actually produce parts on demand or produce at higher volumes, the reliance or the need really to document information and make sure things are traceable was something we were kind of finding a gap in the space for. One, mainly because we started doing some of these projects with organizations, and what we realized is that, hey, a lot of people are just starting basic. That's what we were doing early on, was just trying to use a spreadsheet and track all this information in every build. Sometimes you could get it into a SharePoint database or some sort of other tool that help you manage it. But what we wanted to understand was like, hey, is this just us? Like, are we not really looking at kind of what's out there or understanding the space a little bit? And so about 2 years ago or so, we started what I call kind of a listening tour. We talked to about 50 companies, many organizations that you probably recognize, high-end users of additive, smaller companies with 1 or 2 machines, people that were thinking of additive, and got a sense from them of, okay, if production is kind of your aim or goal, which a lot of people's kind of mantra is about the technology once they can find that business case, how do you anticipate documenting this technical information or even starting with that? And so we heard a lot of different answers, a lot of different problems, and kind of these problems kind of manifested themselves in kind of 3 main ways. One, as I mentioned, that you have a lot of variables in the process, from design to materials to inspection, but not necessarily a consistent framework, even across groups, especially if you're using just Excel, which was kind of we kind of kept track of kind of what some of the answers were to kind of how are people documenting their workflow now. Is the top answer, the Family Feud #1 answer on the board was Excel. So Microsoft is certainly a big player in the additive software, whether they think of themselves of that as or not. But that was about 90 or 80 to 90% of folks, even in large organizations, were documenting all their information or parts of it with multiple Excel spreadsheets spread across email, spread across Dropbox, spread across SharePoint, all of this kind of internal information, which everyone has. Like it's not from a need that people aren't measuring and taking note of the information they're getting. It's just not necessarily organized, and there was no consistent framework. Kind of leading into that, there's not necessarily a centralized data source for companies to kind of pull all this together, right? Additive is kind of growing out of R&D from most companies, and how you run an R&D operation is much different than how you run production. So kind of having that centralized data stores as you move to manufacturing was one of those things that was somewhat challenging for folks. And then the third piece that we heard over and over again is, okay, we've got a pathway. We've built kind of a roadmap here, and we've got some best practices, but how do we expand that out of kind of our one or two rock stars that know how to use the machine, that know all the nuances, know all the kind of nuts and bolts of the materials and ordering kind of consumables and all of this information? How do we kind of build that out into a broader manufacturing kind of space? And that actually was somewhat of a challenge for many folks, especially with turnover and just moving groups, and just kind of personal communication was somewhat of a challenge. So with all that, we wanted to kind of do some metrics as well as, okay, kind of knowing all that, like how long does it actually take to, if you wanted to kind of go into a facility making additive parts and say, okay, we want all the critical elements from design to inspection, all that data together, collated for each part, for each build, for the last month. And how long would that take an average kind of engineer, or average kind of person in charge of that? And we got kind of almost a day's worth of time for every build that is being produced. So on average, you're spending, kind of depending on who it is in the organization, several $1,000s to start to manage this information, especially if it's not organized in a way that's effective. So it's real money that we're kind of talking about. So kind of with all that, we thought, hey, like one, selfishly, we wanted something better for us to use to move this kind of along and help some of the folks we were working with. But really, we wanted to build a tool that was more additive focused. So kind of that's where Trace kind of came from, which is essentially a tool that helps kind of map the additive workflow, and then on top of that kind of architecture, essentially hang formatting. So whether it's a standard that you need to follow or a group of standards, we really kind of incorporated kind of both the workflow and process chain of DMLS and ASTM and SLS on top of standards that are being generated by the American Welding Society, ASTM, a number of other folks, to really help kind of save time and money, kind of help with compliance and making sure you're mapping the right information at the right time, and then ensure traceability throughout the entire process. And so what we've tried to build on this is really kind of looking at standards as a guiding approach to how do we format the information, how do we format the data, along with kind of our best practices from operating and standing up facilities. So we've taken a lot of inputs, and I've spent more time than I care to admit reading all these manufacturing standards and all the working groups and the work and effort that's being done by a lot of tremendous groups, including American Makes and others, to kind of incorporate kind of the general thinking of standards along the lines of building specifications, kind of quality checklists, guidance of auditing parts, as well as kind of operations for specific types of machines, to build a system that kind of allows you to go through that process of validating the data that you're generating, as well as just the work plan itself. So what I wanted to do now, because I think it's pertinent for both the conversation of kind of how do you build your standards out and what you should be doing for your own workflow, as well as the conversation with the software. I'll just go through a demo because I think that really nails it home. So what I want to show now is essentially kind of the embodiment of Trace that we're using now. So Trace is a software tool that essentially is kind of mapping that quality workflow for both materials and process validation in the AM space, and built specifically with additive manufacturing in mind. So the nuances of all the different workflow steps, as well as kind of what types of data people typically track, whether it's materials or final parts. So what I'm showing here is a cloud version. I know cloud is a dirty word for many folks in different organizations, but I'm doing this for efficiency of showing this on a mobile application. But actually, most of our work is on kind of local servers, so kind of an on-premises deployment. So it would look the same, but on kind of a local server, all the information would lie there, just the framework and visualization would be kind of mapped over. So what does this look like? And so when it comes to kind of mapping the process workflow, we think of it in kind of this dashboard, essentially. So we've got active projects, so at a high level, kind of what's going on in your facility. So either by kind of machine or type of part that you're building hundreds or thousands of, so you have an active project status. And activity or kind of status depends on where it is in the workflow. So it could be at just the design validation stage, or it could be at inspection. That's very different stages, and honestly, depending on the type of part you're producing, can be very different amounts of time. Simplest cases, some parts may take a long time in the build to make or post-finish versus some others may be quicker. So you just the status update of that. And then as well, we're starting to calculate and document some of those things that you may be marking or kind of mapping to each build. So things like tensile test results that are that you're incorporating with coupons for each of your production builds. So over time, you can see a map of or graph of your Inconel 718 results for your EOS 290 for the last 3 months and say, okay, how are we doing on this? If there's a dip, you may be able to kind of go back and say, oh, that was when we kind of changed our blend of reuse or something like that, or it was a new material lot. So the ability that I talked about of like how do we get kind of the ability to kind of go back and understand the process a little bit more, and hopefully makes it a little bit easier. Something I wish I would have had the last few years, certainly. And so how we do this, we kind of do it in two ways. So I'll start one with kind of when we talk about materials kind of validation, one of the things that we've wanted to incorporate is there's a couple different ways, either depending on the industry or depending on your appetite for spending money on powders or other materials, but in most cases powders. How are you trying to kind of articulate what material goes into the machine at what time? So it may sound like a fairly trivial question, but for those of you who may be familiar with the technology, can often get complicated, especially if you're thinking about sieving material, reusing it, throwing it back in the machine, as it goes through the machine, what's the thermal kind of history of that. So one of the fundamental things that we do in this is try to understand kind of what does that materials history look like for each blend. If you're doing blends, if it's lots, that same thing apply. But essentially you'd have the ability to kind of look at kind of the different elements of kind of the materials here and start to document within kind of this framework of kind of what's that critical specification that you're building. You still probably need to generate your spec, but what Trace allows is to say, okay, with a certain kind of material or blend, we want to make sure that every time we blend something or every time we get new material in, we've correctly labeled it and we know how much material is there and we know the kind of critical elements in the material itself that map our specification. So as a material scientist in me, this is exciting because you get to actually see, okay, over time, how much material do we have, but also kind of what lot numbers applied to that specific batch, what was the ratio that we used to blend it, what's the chemical composition, kind of do your particle size analysis, things like aspect ratio, what does the particle look like, flow characteristics like angle of repose, rheology if you're doing more kind of viscosity measurements, probably more applicable in the plastic realms, but important nonetheless. But here, kind of what we're able to do is at least show, okay, from this concept of, okay, if you're in the facility, you get a batch of material in from your vendor, you probably have a certificate of conformance that you assign to that. Okay, once it goes in the machine, what happens? And if you blend that again and do all these tests, can it be put back, or do you have a record of what that was? So that's kind of start what we're talking about, of building that workflow. So kind of what I want to go back to though is kind of the actual projects. So once we get into the actual workflow, what we designed this tool to do is, as I mentioned, kind of build on this concept of templates. So what we think of a template is determined either by the type of process that you're using. So DMLS looks different than polymer laser sinting, than multi-jet fusion, than FDM. So we built kind of templates to map to the specific workflows of each of those technologies. But on top of that, there's different workflows potentially if you're doing a process and material validation or a part tracking validation, or just the kind of default process that maps to a specific standard. So I'll show how this works, and kind of what this process record kind of does here is just essentially your bookmark of, okay, like how do we label this, or kind of what's our internal process for naming it. And one thing to keep in mind, we get a lot of questions about this, like how customizable is this? So we actually can change any of the fields and forms here to map nomenclature that assigns to a specific way an organization label something, or have custom numbers or something like that. So that's very easy, and we can actually do it in a second or two here. But you're also able to set access rules for this, because depending on the sophistication of your organization or the size, or whether you're sending parts out for inspection or something like that, you may not want everybody to see every part of the process. So you may be able to just say, hey, we're going to only allow 3 degrees internal teams to do this. So you could assign that. So imagine that I filled this information in. What we're able to do then is keep an eye up. They create new process areas. We've got this now map of the entire process for the additive manufacturing flow. So kind of, if I would have filled something in there, you would have seen that information. But then we get into kind of just more and more granularity to tell that story of each part. So things like, okay, what standard are we trying to map to? We can input that there, and what that does is then helps to articulate, okay, if we do that and go to file and design, within that standard or within that framework, here's what you want to be documenting each part, each process, each build, to make sure that you're both aligning to the data flow requirements, or the data kind of requirements for quality audits, as well as both helping your kind of process internally. So file and design, you want to document things like your file names, your formats, where it's being housed, build orientation, version number, often critical, and then things like, are you including test specimens in the build? Are there specific features that you're looking at? So really kind of getting that design element here. In the stock area, this is kind of what we just did. So if we want to look at something like, let's do a stainless steel one. So we've got a map in there. So what that allows is you pick your material, if you're using 17.4 stainless, and then a drop down allows you to say, okay, here's the specific blend that we've been using for Q1 2019, and you can put that information, or that would have mapped over from what we were doing before. You're also able to include your certificate of conformance test or something as an attachment as well. Really just kind of this idea of hammering home the idea of kind of what's the story of this part, what's the story of this build. So you have kind of that full traceability back. Then you get into the process itself, so machine information. So we'll typically think about in terms of validating a process. So machine ID, model number, serial number of that machine, configuration date, when it was maintenance, kind of maybe doing build plate measurements every part. And this, I forgot to mention in the beginning. So this process workflow is specific to kind of a DMLS, kind of standard DMLS process. Obviously, it would be adapted if you wouldn't need this if you're doing a multi-jet fusion build, because you're doing the build plate measurements as robustly here. But things like your oxygen limit, flow rates, temperatures, your parameter files you could add in here, operators, build date, things like that. And one thing we are doing now, we're actually starting to work with a number of vendors on the machine side to automatically get some of this data into the process workflow. We're trying to make sure that you don't boil the ocean in terms of getting everything. We're still trying to map to kind of those critical elements that you need from a process and aligning to standards perspective. So some of this can be automated versus me just showing you'd be able to have to fill it in. The next phase is kind of the post-processing side. So, okay, what happens after the build? So after the machine shuts off, what are you doing? So maybe you started as a material to use. That's one element, but then what was the part cooling? How long was it cooling? What was your stress relief profile? Again, this is DMLS. So are you doing wire EDM or bandsawing the build off? So you'll be able to kind of check what's happening, as well as add in your kind of specific procedures that you're doing for that. If you have a specific stress relief profile for your Type 64 or your stainless or whatever it may be, you can start to add those elements in here too. And then again, who's processing it, what the date of that was, and then getting into that inspection stage where you have what you're doing to the as-built parts. So those are things that may just be coming out of the machine to validate the machine worked, as well as kind of tests that you may be doing as finished parts, so something that the customer may actually see. So oftentimes those standards may be a little bit different, or maybe it wouldn't make sense to look at a surface roughness kind of measurement on your as-built parts if what you're sending is totally finished, sanded, or ground, or whatever it may be. So kind of two levels of that in here as well. And then kind of your tensile or other mechanical properties that you'd have in the part. So this is where you can start to get some of those nice analytics of articulating, okay, over time, we've got these last 10 builds of our 17.4 stainless. Here's our tensile properties. Here's when we change blends. Do we see a change or not? And that's all important, again, for quality. Then you have a sign off. Someone would say that's complete. What then that looks like is go to your completed list. You could kind of pull up what the process record, process information for that material or that process, things like that. You can export a full report in a PDF in one click, or just an abstract if you wanted. And so that's really kind of the element of kind of what you're doing here to look at kind of that full process information. And what this essentially is doing is, okay, now you have somewhere where you can have the information encompass the entire workflow. You can manage it by team members that may be filling in information, but it's all in one place and it's all kind of clearly articulated here. And then kind of the last thing that we kind of felt was important was there's a whole host of information that is critical to the operation of the facility that may not necessarily align or be kind of adjacent to, as we call it, to the actual workflow of the process. So having a way to kind of document what your critical standards you're looking at, both from a specifications maybe, or your safety standards, things like that, you may want just one repository so everyone can know where that is. Similarly, with your material specs, you want that there as well, so you can know every time you get in a lot number or something, you know where your certificate of conformance is. Training elements as well, so you want to know who's been trained on what machine or what type of training they've received, whether it's a safety training, whether it's an operation training or training from the vendor. You can see who's been trained on what, so that can be documented, as well as things like operating procedures. Again, I mean, it's not the sexiest of things to talk about, but really important to make sure kind of from a repeatability standpoint, you know what the latest is, and what the operations are, and if things change, or if you get a new machine or a new employee, that can be updated fairly easily. Similarly, if you wanted to look at maintenance, which is another kind of underrepresented thing in the AM space and kind of tooling, is kind of making sure that you have a way to document things like maintenance. So weekly, monthly, kind of every build type of thing, you'd be able to have a kind of check marks and boxes of kind of checking the gas and the vacuums and everything related to that. So those are elements of the facility that are kind of, we think, are critical. Again, because you have all of it in one place, it's nice to be able to log in and have multiple users look at that, especially as you grow your organization. So that's just a quick demo, kind of goes through what I wanted to really articulate there, is all the different kind of ways and kind of levels of detail you can go to in documenting your AIM workflow. This is probably, if I'm honest, it may not be everything. Usually in terms of who we're working with, it's about 90% of the way there. There's elements that we can adjust, and levels of detail or organization-specific things that we can trial. But as I mentioned, we can quickly add a new template and reformat things very, very easily. So that was kind of the demo part. I want to just go back to kind of a couple of quick things that we'll talk about before we kind of wrap up here, and give you some time for questions. So again, if you have questions, type them in. Jason will take care of collating those, and I'll be happy to answer them with kind of several minutes left. So we've done some work with folks like Renishaw and other organizations to kind of look at how this might work as a first embodiment, and doing things like tensile builds, and tracking that information. And just kind of articulate a few case studies on how we're using this. We're doing a case study now with this isn't the part, but it's kind of representative, a medical product where we need to have lot level traceability for a 3D printed part that is part of the medical device. So what we're using Trace for, what the kind of users using Trace for, is to help with articulating those process details of that workflow, of everything from what material was used, what tensile properties are coming out, what kind of batch numbers of materials, and who was the operator and what date. So that's kind of aligning to one of the ASTM F3901 standards, more on the polymer side, but kind of start to get the idea of, okay, how might you be able to document some of this information as you move forward. So, and again, it depends on the level of detail that you need. So you may not, what I'm showing may be overkill for what you're doing, and that's totally okay. And I think asking those types of questions is really important, because you can get on both sides of the spectrum. You can probably analyze, and to the point where you're paralyzed and not doing any kind of real production work, or on the opposite end, kind of being naive or not kind of putting blinders on to what is possible or what is being done in the space of qualification is not good either. So I think for every organization, there's somewhere in the middle that may make sense in terms of how you want to qualify your process and parts. But some of the organizations I mentioned in the beginning, ASTM and American makes us some good documentation with the ANSI collaboration, and I know NIST is doing some really good stuff with documentation nomenclature. There's a lot of good stuff out there now. Feel free to email me if you want to talk about that, or I can point you in the right direction or introduce you to some of those working group heads, because I think there's a lot of good work going on that at least can help that conversation. May not use everything, and your industry may not require everything, but there are kind of ways to help effectively manage quality and your workflow in this process. And especially in this time where the machines are getting better, they're not perfect, and each machine's slightly different, and there's still going to be this kind of element of uncertainty to some degree, but I think you can engineer around that. You can manage risk safely with it, and have a documentation that backs up some of those claims. So I'm not going to kind of detail on this, but essentially from a security perspective, this is always something we get questioned on. But as I mentioned, on the cloud version, we kind of apply all the best practices from kind of security control and role-based authorized users. We're doing mostly on premises, so obviously that's kind of unique to every facility, and a lot of that would be taken care of locally. But kind of as we kind of wrap up, and I want to make sure I have some time for questions in the next, so I'll wrap this up in the next 30 seconds or so. So why should you be thinking about this? And no matter where you are in the process, I think there's always something that I'm hopeful that you can kind of take away from this, is that quality management, repeatability inevitably comes up. It's often not the first thing that comes up, which sometimes makes it painful to implement after the fact. But making sure you at least think about these challenges, think about kind of how you're doing it internally, or how you might do it. So I think there's elements there that is just good to know. And often what we've seen is if you do a good job with this, you can often educate whoever's kind of in the auditing space and help them kind of help that conversation go more smoothly. And because 3D printing additive production is somewhat unique to a lot of different industries, and it may be the first time that you're doing this, but groups like American Makes and others, and there's a lot of good resources. Some of these types of webinars and things that it serves to connect people that are going down this path. So other things to remember, at least from what we've seen, kind of trying to build your own solution is costly and can be time consuming. So take a look at what's on the market, and certainly on the standard side, kind of at least get yourself familiar with what's going on there as well. So just as a last slide, so we're live with Trace. We launched an AMUG earlier this year. We're kind of in a number of facilities doing cases, and we'll be trying to continually improve the feature and really work with folks, because I learn the most when I'm on the factory floor and operating these machines kind of collaboratively with folks, and so we're trying to get it as best we can. And it's a learning process, and if you do have any questions about that or what we're doing there, feel free to reach out and we can schedule some time to talk. But that's it for now. Hopefully, we've got a few minutes left. If you have questions, we've got some time. My email is there, mike@3degreescompany.com. I'll shoot me an email or ask me a question or whatnot, and we'll find a way to get slides, or if you don't see slides or a copy of the video posted, just drop me a note and I'll be happy to share those. Well, thank you for your time. So we've got a handful of minutes left if there are questions.
All right, thank you, Mike. We will now head into our Q&A section. So if you do have any questions, feel free to go ahead and type them in the box. So I have a few questions here ready. Mike, what should be my first step if I'm just getting started thinking about production AM and validating my processes and materials?
Sure. I think the first process is kind of making sure you engage with kind of the entire workflow chain in your organization, and not only kind of from design but to inspection, and understand who's involved in that, people-wise, and kind of start a conversation there. And what we always do, and working with kind of our folks and partners, is actually map that out and go through each step of the process, kind of spend a day or half a day or a couple hours just saying, okay, what's the next step? What's the next step? What's the next step? And then you can kind of build your process tree to say, okay, here's all the things we're doing. Here's where variability comes into play, or here's where we need more analysis. And then you can kind of build from there depending on the requirements of your industry. But usually that's where I start.
All right, thanks, Mike. Another question. What's the biggest challenge that you see organizations having when they look at qualifying their materials and processes?
Sure. I think like when to stop is a hard question for most people, because you can really get in the weeds of kind of when is qualified enough, or when is enough analysis enough. So I think having a kind of framework that you can kind of either engineer to, or make sure that you're kind of doing something that is robust from an engineering, material science, kind of mechanical engineering perspective, but also kind of fits into kind of business or organization requirements for timelines or cost or whatnot. You could spend a year, 2 years just making tensile bones, but kind of what's the right approach for your company, and where does that make sense? So that's usually one of the biggest challenges I've seen.
Okay, and what industries do you see most leveraging a tool like Trace?
Sure. I think for now, what we've seen is kind of areas that are not uncommon to what a lot of the end use cases are. So medical, aerospace, areas that have a little bit more regulation, as well as a little bit more documentation related to additive. So I think, and those conversations are continuing to grow. But those are early ones, but I think there's a number of others as well. Okay,
great. Well, that will wrap up today's TRX webinar series. I would just like to thank our presenter, Mike Vasquez of 3 Degrees. If you have further questions for Mike, please reach out to him directly at mike@3degreescompany.com. There will be a post-webinar survey going out to all those who participated. We do really appreciate the time that you take to provide American-Makes feedback, so we may continue to improve and strengthen the additive community. As a reminder, if you think you or your organization would be interested in sharing on the TRX webinar series, please fill out the form that follows the presentation or reach out to Tiffany Westbay.